And we're going to start.
Nos hemos ubicado en lo que son las ambiciones y lo que son, digamos, todas las directrices, distintas directrices que van a animar el concepto Volcanic en esta edición 2021 y en las venideras aquí en Lanzarote. Y ahora vamos a ubicarnos ya de una forma más seria en los territorios volcánicos. Vamos a ubicarnos en los volcanes. Para ello, tenemos a una de las autoridades en vulcanología, tenemos a Joan Martí,
most prominent volcanologist in volcanology. He is director of geoscience in Barcelona at the CSIC in Barcelona, at the Spanish National Research Council. So, Joan Martí, the floor is yours.
First of all, I would like to say thank you to the organisers for inviting me to take part in this event. I think it's going to be a huge success. And I'd like to congratulate the organisers for choosing this space, one of the jewels of volcanology, to host the event. It's really a privilege to be able to kick off the event in this space, Jameos del Agua. It was a space created by nature, but of course was then adapted by César Manrique, a local artist who was very involved with the beginning as well of the studies involving volcanoes. The idea of my talk today is to give you a volcanic vision of the world. So I'd like to explain basically what volcanoes are, and to talk about some of the most prominent volcanic eruptions that have really set the way for volcanology as a field of study. Now, of course, with what's happening in La Palma right now, there have been lots of volcanologists on TV and in media, but actually there still isn't a university degree anywhere in the world in volcanology. There are master's programs on offer in France, but that's it. So it's really a multidisciplinary field. People come to volcanology from other fields of study to try and understand these volcanoes, but this title, volcanologist, is often quite difficult to digest because it really doesn't exist as a profession. There are physicists and biologists, etc., but not so much volcanologists. So, well, what I'd like to do today is give a basic overview of what volcanoes are, how they work, and why they're so important. And this is perhaps the key part of my presentation today. So the first question we have to take into account is, what is a volcano? Well, of course, everyone has some kind of idea. They have an image in their mind because they've seen pictures in books or on TV, but really we need to define a volcano as a point on the Earth's surface where molten Earth appears in the form of magma. If this isn't there, then it's not a volcano. We can have mountains of all kinds of sizes, but if it has this magma, then it's a volcano. And another important thing then is that if this molten rock comes from the interior of the Earth, then this means that this volcano is going to give us information about what's underneath us. So this is what's really interesting about volcanoes, apart from many other things that we'll look at today. But this is the main key aspect. Volcanoes exist because our planet is dynamic, it's alive, it's in constant movement in its interior. Tectonic plates lie underneath us that give our Earth its form, but they're in constant movement. Sometimes they move just a few centimeters a year or just a few millimeters, but they're always in movement. They crash into each other, some separate from each other. And what's happening in La Palma, I'm sure, has something to do with something that's happening, for instance, in Indonesia, on the other side of the world, because everything is related. So it's key that we understand this relationship and this dynamic of our planet. I always find it funny when people say that we spend so much time and money studying space, and we often forget to study our own planet, where we live. So it seems a little bit, it doesn't really seem to make much sense, no? We really should be studying more where we live before we study places outside of our planet. Volcanoes are usually located in specific locations at the joining points of different tectonic plates. There is a reason behind everything that happens. And so scientists in this field want to understand this processes very clearly, but once we've done that, the harder thing is really to explain it. But the key thing to remember then is that our planet is in constant motion in its core. And this motion, this movement, is what causes earthquakes and volcanoes. Why are volcanoes important? Well, there are many reasons. First and foremost, we're here thanks to volcanoes. If it weren't for volcanoes, there wouldn't be an atmosphere. And without an atmosphere, there wouldn't be life. They have given us life. But they have also given us many important natural resources, raw materials for construction, for energy, geothermal energy above all. They've offered us very fertile areas of land. Many settlements have actually been established in the surroundings of volcanoes. Despite the danger, people choose to live there because of the rich soil. They're also important because, well, quite obviously, there is an economic link. In the Canaries, tourism is a key economic factor, and many people come here to appreciate the volcanic landscape. This type of volcano tourism has grown a great deal in recent years, and so it's something that must be taken care of. It's good also to be able to offer our tourists information, background about what they're seeing. One of the downsides, of course, to volcanoes is the risk involved. As with most natural processes, volcanoes do bring with them negative consequences on our lives. And this is because ultimately they're doing what they're supposed to do. And they're only causing us harm because we've invaded their natural space. And sometimes we don't do this in the correct way, and this means that the impact is greater than it possibly should be. It can result in a loss of life, a loss of economy. So wherever there is a volcano, there is danger. And the level of this danger depends on our interaction with this volcano. And this is a key thing to consider. It's often very misunderstood, actually. How do volcanoes work, then? Well, it's quite simple, really. They are liquids submitted to pressure. These liquids contain dissolved gas, and it creates an excess of pressure underneath the rock. And once that pressure reaches a certain limit, it breaks through the rock and it releases to the surface. It's really exactly the same as this image you have here of a bottle of champagne. This is a liquid that's stored under pressure, and when you take the lid off, it comes gushing out. And we're going to see this basic phenomenon throughout our presentations. How big are volcanoes? Well, in fact, the one in La Palma, although it may appear to be very big, it's a very small eruption. There have been huge eruptions. There are huge volcanoes. Teide, for example, you all know, from its highest point until the base of its volcanic cone, there are 8 kilometers, because it's not just what we see above ground. The volcano actually goes much, much deeper. Its underwater lowest point is 8 kilometers below. In Garrocha, in Catalonia, there is another volcano you can see in this image above. And this really characterizes the size of the volcanic eruption. Once again, there can be huge eruptions and very small eruptions. Here we have some examples. At the bottom, you can see the Toba caldera. We're going to look at this later. The crater measures 100 by almost 40 kilometers. So this means that it must have been an absolutely huge eruption. Now, when we study the size of volcanoes, we look at the cubic kilometers of magma that it emits. This helps us to calculate the amount of energy that's been expelled, that is measured with the magma that it emits, as I said. By calculating how much magma is released, we can calculate how strong it was and what the heat energy is. This is a scale that goes from 1 to 8, much like the Richter scale. And we can see here some eruptions. La Palma, for instance, as I said, it's causing huge destruction, but it's very small. But here we have some examples of huge eruptions, Pinatubo, for instance. So let's get a better idea about the scale of these volumes of magma. This is 1 cubic kilometer of magma. So it's 1,000 by 1,000 by 1,000 meters. So that's 1 to the power of 9 cubic meters. But of course, that's a figure that's very hard for us to understand in real terms. So this may be a more recognizable image. It's the football stadium in Barcelona, Camp Nou. And it would be as though you filled this 420 times to the top. That would be 1 cubic kilometer. So that's a huge amount. But it's also the same as giving every single person on the planet, 7.5 billion people, a half a ton. That's 1 cubic kilometer. So that gives us a better idea of what we're dealing with here. This is another unfortunate way that we measure volcanoes, by the amount of deaths that it's caused. So we have examples here of volcanic eruptions that have caused 20,000 deaths. But what this is really a measure of is the problem of this interaction with the volcanoes, the way that we, people, relate to our surroundings. So if we see that an eruption has caused a lot of loss of life, then it tells us that something went wrong at some point in time. How do we study volcanoes? Well, via the rocks. As you know, in La Palma, there's lots of lava and ash, and we go and collect that and study it to figure out what the eruption has been like. By collecting these materials in situ, it helps us to study all of the details, not only of this eruption, but also previous eruptions. So we use geology. And how do we monitor volcanoes? This is a common question, whether or not volcanoes warn us before they erupt. Well, in most cases, yes, but we have to know how to listen to the volcanoes, and we have to be there. We can't monitor a volcano if our teams aren't there on site. So we have a whole series of tools that help us to do this. When there is an active volcano, we install these tools to monitor different things, because usually, as I say, volcanoes do give some warning, perhaps a couple of months. In La Palma we had 10 days warning. Sometimes it's only 3 days, sometimes it's years. But they usually do give a warning. We just have to know how to understand that warning. And what impact do volcanic eruptions have? Well, the impact can be very diverse. There can be direct impacts, so ash falling on our roofs that need cleaning. We can't throw this ash in the drains because it would block up the drains, so we have to dispose of it another way. It can have an impact on aeroplanes. These days there are more flights than ever, and this can be very dangerous because it can get inside the engines. I'm not sure how to go back a slide, sorry. But let's just say it's dangerous. For instance, the eruption in Iceland 10 years ago completely paralyzed air traffic for over 3 months, with billions lost. It wasn't a particularly big eruption, but it happened in a particular moment with particular atmospheric conditions, which led to this huge disaster. And this is the problem. We need to understand how volcanoes work, we need to be on the ball with what they're doing, and we need to prepare ourselves. We need to take the necessary measures in each case so that these impacts are minimized as far as possible. This is our job as scientists, and it's also the job of those people that receive our information, that need to use it to take these appropriate measures. So I'm going to talk about some of the most significant volcanic eruptions in my opinion. The first is Toba. I showed a picture earlier. This was the biggest eruption that has ever been known in recent geology, in the past 75,000 years. It took place in Indonesia, and it created this huge caldera, as I said, measuring 100 by 35 kilometers, and 3,000 cubic kilometers of magma were ejected into the air. So it was 3,000 of those, that comparison that we made earlier with the football stadium. The hominoids that existed at that time, many of them went extinct. So there was the humans, the people that existed at that time. So human evolution was affected because of this volcanic eruption. There was a lack of food, so certain species died out. So this volcano had a global effect and potentially could have caused a mass extinction. Nos hemos saltado la vuestra. A ver, ¿se puede ir para atrás en la diapositiva? A ver, ¿se puede ir para atrás? Can we go back one slide? Yo desde aquí no sé cómo va. Here we go. Oh, no, one more. No, anterior. This one, yes, this is your volcano, Timanfaya, 1730 to 1736. This was the second biggest eruption in volume to have occurred in Europe in history. So this was 2 to 3 kilometers cubed of magma, so nothing in comparison to this previous example, but it had a huge impact. At European level, there was an effect from the sulfur that was emitted. Trees, for instance, actually demonstrate a reduction in their growth in the time surrounding this eruption. Just before this eruption, there was a famine in Lanzarote, and people began to emigrate. And when this eruption occurred, many more decided to emigrate. And many of these people arrived in the US, and they founded the Alamo Mission in Texas, the very famous site of this battle between the Texans and the Americans. This was founded by people from Lanzarote. Many people don't know this, but it's true. They left during and slightly before this eruption in 1730. Another significant eruption took place in Laki in Iceland. This was the biggest eruption, actually, in Europe. It emitted a huge amount of magma into the atmosphere with a high volume of sulfur. This led to a nuclear winter that lasted 2 years. It led to a famine in Europe that, according to Benjamin Franklin, who was the representative of the US in France at the time, well, he said that it was the trigger for the French Revolution. So another example of an eruption here that had a regional impact of significant strength. This is another eruption in the year 1979. So this eruption took place in the year 79. And we are all very familiar with it because we have found in Pompeii mummies, people that were trapped by this ash. In fact, what we know is that these people were worried that the eruption was going to happen. Many people left their home, but the authorities forced them to go back to their town, and that was when the eruption actually happened. Montpellier in Martinique in 1902. This was what happened to the city after this pyroclastic flows. Only 2 people survived. One of those people was in prison. The others died because there were a local celebration, a religious celebration that day, and so people had come together, and absolutely everybody perished because the whole city was completely flattened. Another significant eruption in terms of human interaction was this one in Iceland, because people tried to stop the eruption. They sprayed water in front of the falling lava, and actually, for some reason, it worked, and they managed to save the port. This was a very important fishing port, and so they were desperate for the lava not to arrive at the port. Can we just go one back, please? Mount St. Helens in 1980 then in the US. This was 1 cubic kilometer of magma, but it caused huge devastation, and it was most important because it really set the beginning of modern volcanology. It was the turning point from classical volcanology to the modern version. Ever since this eruption, we've tried to quantify volcanic activity, to attach numbers and models to this science. Before, it was a descriptive science. We described the rocks, their morphology, etc. But after this eruption, everything changed. This was the beginning of the way we work with volcanoes today. As I said, this changed from descriptive volcanology to quantitative volcanology. Chichón in 1982 in Mexico followed, let's say, the path of Vesuvius. Those people that lived around the volcano noticed changes in the atmosphere, an increase in noise. They fled, they evacuated. The authorities in Mexico forced them to go back, and the next day there was a volcano and everybody perished. So once again the same thing happened, something that really should never happen. This is another well-known eruption because, very sadly, two of the main volcanologists of the time lost their lives. They were very unlucky, they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. It wasn't a very big eruption. Maurice and Kate Fwaff. But what did the Japanese do? Well, rather than trying to recover this area, what they decided to do was to leave the affected area as a museum so that others in the future will be able to understand what volcanoes do. And perhaps this is what we should do in La Palma. I don't know, it's a suggestion. But this was what they decided to do here. Nevado de Ruiz is another example of bad management. There was prior warning of what would happen, but nobody paid attention because the second harvest of cotton was about to be collected. The countryside needed to be prepared, so there was no order for evacuation. And 28,000 people died. Another example, as I say, of poor management. Lagunias in Cameroon in 86 then. I was present actually during this eruption. We still really don't know what happened because they died because they were suffocated by CO2. 1,700 people and 4,000 livestock animals in one night. And really, although we think we know what happened, we don't know the details. Pinatubo in Filipinas, bigger than Mount St. Helens, 8 cubic kilometers of magma. This caused a worldwide change, a half a degree drop in temperature in the year following the eruption in the North Hemisphere, because of the components of this eruption. In 2000, the lava flows destroyed this city in Congo, but most people had evacuated in time. So in Congo, there was greater knowledge, greater awareness about volcanoes than in many other places in the world. So this is something that's a byproduct of volcanoes. We're going here tomorrow, actually, is Lot de Eladio in Timanfaya. There are lots of other movements, for instance in Garrocha in Catalonia, to do with volcanic cuisine. Tourist offerings directly related with the world of volcanoes. This is something that we're harnessing now. Everything can be culture, everything can be knowledge, and it can help us to fill our stomachs too. Thank you.
Moltes gràcies.